So here's everything you're going to need to make an alpaca reroot. I've got my dome, I've got my scalp. I'm also going to use some PVA. This is Elmer's school glue, but any PVA should work fine. Some elastic bands, any kind of pin. These are dressmaking pins, but anything will do. And a brush. Mine's quite grubby, I really should get a new one, but this is what I'm working with. So I'll clear the area so I've got a little bit of space. And I'm just going to start off by brushing the scalp and getting it ready. I don't want to start with a knotty scalp just because the nicer it's brushed, the nicer it can be tied up, and I just save myself hassle in the long run. I tie my scalp into 2 small buns. This gets the hair really nice and out of the way. The more out of the way it is, the less likely you are to get any glue on it. And then I pick off any kind of excess fluff or any kind of overhanging hairs, because you will have a few no matter how good you are at rerooting. So you can see here these 2 tabs are at the front, and then the ones with the largest space is at the back. Now I'm just going to pop my dome inside. The dome is a harder plastic one. Sometimes the 2 tabs at the front are actually one singular tab, but the tabs at the back, there will always be 2 of them, and there will always be a gap because this is where the screws go in at the back of the head. Now I'm just going to take my glue. One of the reasons why PVA is preferable as opposed to some other glues is because if you do make a mistake with it, any kind of like warm water will get it out of the hair just by being slow and careful, whereas something like hot glue would rip the hair out. Also, it's strong enough to keep it in place, but if you do want to remove it, it's not actually going to cause any damage to the scalp, or it's not very likely to cause damage to the scalp. You don't need a lot of glue. I just put enough in that I can use something to slide it the whole way in between in that little groove. This way it will stick to the flange of the scalp when I pop that in. Now that I have a little bit of glue inside the grooves on my dome, I can place it back on top. It's handy to have something like a wet towel nearby, because this way you can wipe your fingers, get any kind of glue residue off, because what you don't want to do is be transferring any glue onto the hair. As I said earlier, it's only PVA, so with some warm water you will be able to get it off, but it's much easier if you don't get any on there in the first place. So again, I'm just sliding those flanges through. This can be a little bit messy because you do have glue inside those grooves. So you may have to take a few breaks just to make sure your hands are nice and clean. You can see I'm being quite tentative because even though I'm pulling the flange through, I don't actually want to get my hands very messy because I don't want to get anything on the hair. Once I pulled it the whole way through, I place a pin in it and this keeps it in place. You don't want to pull particularly tight. You want it to be the whole way through, but don't overstretch it, because then the scalp will be up at an angle and there will actually be a gap. It won't be more tight, there'll be a gap when you put the scalp on the doll. So I continue going around the scalp, pulling those flanges through the grooves in the dome and placing pins when I've got it in the whole way. So you want it to be just lined up perfectly against it. You don't want there to be a gap, but you also don't want to pull too tightly, because if you pull too tightly, you'll actually end up pulling it up at an angle and away from the head. This method only actually works if you have flanges on your scalp. So if you're rerooting a factory scalp and it comes with flanges, please don't cut them off if you have a dome, because honestly, this is so much easier than the elastic band method. So you wouldn't use this method on a Kenner, and you would not use this method if you didn't have flanges on the scalp that you were using. But if you have them, this is way, way easier than the elastic band method, which maybe I'll show you another time. So you can see I'm pulling up the whole way, just putting another pin in there, and I'm just going to go back round, double check, see if anything needs to be a bit tighter, and if it's not lined up properly, I'm going to adjust it and I'll repin it before it dries. So the purpose of the pin is just to keep the scalp in place whilst it's drying. After it's dry, you would take the pins out and then you can trim down the flanges if they are in the right position. If they're not, again, it's only PVA, so with a little bit of water and a little bit of force, you will be able to pull those back out, but they shouldn't come out accidentally. So I actually left this overnight, and when it was dry, I went ahead and I pulled out all of those pins to see what I was left with and to see if I was happy with the final product. You want to make sure that you're happy with what you have before you cut those flanges off, because it's much harder to sort out once you've trimmed that excess. You can trim it down a little bit if you're having a struggle fitting it on your doll to check, but I would not cut them off until you've perfectly checked it. And here I'm just pulling out a tiny bit of glue that got stuck to the hair. If you have the doll with you, I would pop it on and I would just see how you feel about that before you do the trimming, but I actually don't have the doll that this is going on with me, so I'm just going to do it by eye. I'm happy with how it looks and I'm going to trim these off. I'm using a pair of scissors here, but a scalpel would do a fine job either. So once they're off, the next thing I want to do is put a little bit more glue on them, because I don't want it to come loose. And when they're trimmed, you'll see that you actually have some small gaps that could be filled in between the scalp flanges and the actual dome itself. So you want it to be nice and tight because you want it to hold in place. And once it's screwed in, it will be even tighter. So I'm just taking my PVA back and I'll just fill in those gaps with my PVA. And then I may get a little needle or I may get an awl, and then I'll help to poke that right down into the gap so that it's nice and strong and filled. In order to get the very back part where the back screw goes in nice and tight, because there will be a gap there because there's nowhere for it to slot into, I take a pin, I put it in diagonally, I glue it, and then I leave it there until it dries so that it dries nice and tight and glued to the back of the scalp. So here's my finished reroot. It's a dyed blonde alpaca reroot. It's floor length. I hope you feel more confident now attaching scalps to domes, and I hope this was helpful or at least interesting to some of you.